Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Frostbee VTubing. I am Frost, and today we are back with more of me reading through and giving my thoughts on A Court of Thorn and Roses. Today, I think we'll be doing chapters 2 and 3 instead of just chapter 2, just because chapter 1 wasn't all that long when I read through it. And I haven't done one of these in a little bit. Filmed one of these, rather. So I think we'll do chapters 2 and 3. And yeah. With that, let's get into it. The sun set by the time I exited the forest, my knees shaking. My hands, stiff from clenching the legs of the deer, had gone entirely numb miles ago. Not even a carcass would ward off the deepening chill. The world was awash in hues of dark blue, interrupted only by the shafts of buttery light, escaping from the shuttered windows of our dilapidated cottage. It was like striding through a living painting, a fleeting moment of stillness, the blues swiftly shifting to solid darkness. As I trudged up the path, each step fueled by only a near dizzying hunger, my sister's voices fluttered out to meet me. I didn't even need to discern their words to know they were most likely chattering about some young man or ribbons they'd spotted in the village, when they should have been chopping wood. But I smiled a bit nonetheless. I kicked my boots. Oh, did I scroll down too far? Okay. I kicked my boots. My mic is in the way of me seeing. Okay. We'll just have to move the mic ever so slightly and hope that you guys don't hear it. Although the mic picks up the lowest little things. Where was I? I kicked my boots against the stone door frame, knocking the snow from them. Bits of ice came free from the gray stones of the cottage, revealing a faded ward markings etched around the threshold. My father had once convinced a passing charlatan to trade the engravings against fairy harm in exchange for one of his wood carvings. There was so little that my father was ever able to do for us that I hadn't possessed the heart to tell him that the engravings were useless and undoubtedly fake. Mortals don't possess enough magic, and didn't possess any of the superior strength or speed of the fae or high fae, of the fairies or high fae. The man, claiming to be some high fae, have some high fae blood in his ancestry, had just carved whorls and swirls and runes around the door and windows. Okay, talking about magic for a second as a pagan. The thing is it's all about intent and knowledge and belief. So if you believe those work, belief will do quite a bit of what you want it to. So if her dad believes in this ability, it's gonna be part of it. Keep it nice. But to get back to the story, carved swirls and swirls and runes around the door and windows, and muttered a few nonsense words, and ambled on his way. I yanked open the wooden door, and the frozen iron handle biting my skin like an asp. Was it supposed to be a wasp? Like a wasp? I'ma think it's a wasp. Heat and light blinded me as I slipped inside. Feyre! Elaine's soft gasp scraped past my ears, and I blinked back the brightness. Cat, get away from my feet. Leia, get away from my feet. and I blinked back the brightness of the fire to find my second eldest sister before me. Though she was bundled in a threadbare blanket, her golden brown hair, the hair all three of us had. Oh, so they have like a golden brown. That's just dirty blonde, isn't it? All three of us had was coiled perfectly around her head. 8 years of poverty hadn't stripped her of her desire to look lovely. Where did you get that? The undercurrent of hunger honed her words into a sharpness that had become too common in the recent weeks. No mention of the blood on me. I'd long since given up hope on them actually noticing whether I came back from the woods every evening, at least until they got hungry again. But then again, my mother hadn't made them swear anything when they stood beside her deathbed. Oh, hadn't made them swear anything when they stood beside her deathbed. I took a calming breath as I slung the dough off my shoulders. She hit the wooden table with a thud, rattling a ceramic cup on its other end. Where do you think I got it? My voice turned hoarse, each word burning as it came out. My father and Nesta all still silently warmed their hands by the hearth, my eldest sister ignoring him as usual. I peeled the wolf pelt from the dough's body, and after removing my boots and setting them by the door, I turned to Elaine. Her brown eyes, my father's eyes, remained pinned on the dough. Will it take you long to clean it? Me, not her, not the others. I'd never once seen their hands, sticky with blood and fur. I'd only learned to prepare and harvest my kills thanks to the instruction of others. Elaine pushed her hand against her belly, probably as empty and aching as my own. It wasn't that Elaine was cruel. She wasn't like Nesta, who had been born with a sneer on her face. Elaine sometimes just didn't grasp things. It was meanness that kept her. It wasn't meanness that kept her from offering to help. It simply never occurred to her that she might be capable of getting her hands dirty. I'd never been able to decide whether she actually didn't understand that we were truly poor, or she just refused to accept it. Still, it hadn't stopped me from buying her seeds for the flower garden she tended in the milder months, whenever I could afford it. And it hadn't stopped her from buying me 3 small tins of paint, red, yellow, and blue, during that same summer that I'd had enough to buy the ash arrow. It was the only gift she'd ever given me, and our house still bore the marks of it, even if the paint was now fading and chipped. Little vines and flowers along the windows and thresholds, the edges of things, tiny curls of flame on stones bordering the hearth. The spare minutes I'd had that bountiful summer I used to bedeck our house in color. I've never heard of bedeck before. I'll have to look that up later. Or actually, Alexa, what does bedeck mean?
As a noun, deck can have a few meanings. 1. A floor-like surface wholly or partially occupying
Alexa,
one level.
Stop. Hey Siri, what is bedeck?
Okay, I found this on the web for what does bedeck. Check it out.
To clothe with finery. Okay, so like decorating. Why couldn't we just use decorate? That seems a bit much. Anyway, moving on. What? Oh, right. Bedeck. Find bedeck. Our house in color, sometimes hiding clever decorations inside the drawers, behind the threadbare curtains, underneath the chairs and table. We hadn't had a summer that easy since. Feyre! My father's deep rumble came from the fire. Oh, Feyre! My father's deep rumble came from the fire. His dark beard was neatly trimmed, face spotless like my sister's. What luck you've had today in bringing us such a feast. From beside my father, Nesta snorted. Not surprising. Any bit of praise for anyone, me, Elaine, other villagers, usually resulted in her dismissal. And any word from our father usually resulted in her ridicule as well. Okay, so is she gonna die at some point? That'd be great. If she's just gonna be a bitch all the time. I straightened, almost too tired to stand, but braced a hand on the table beside the dough as I shot Nesta a glare. Of us, Nesta had taken the loss of our fortune the hardest. She quietly resented my father from the moment we'd fled our manor. Even after that awful day, one of the creditors had come to show just how displeased he was at the loss of his investment. But at least Nesta didn't fill our heads with useless talk of regaining our wealth like my father. No, she just spent whatever money I couldn't hide from her, and rarely bothered to acknowledge my father's limping presence at all. Some days I couldn't tell which of us was the more wretched and bitter. We can eat half the meat this week, I said, shifting my gaze to the dough. The deer took up nearly the entirety of the rickety table that served as our dining area, workspace, and kitchen. We can dry out the other half, I went on, knowing that no matter how nicely I phrased it, I'd still do the bulk of it. And I'll go to the market tomorrow to see how much I can get for the hides. I finished, more to myself than to them. No one bothered to confirm that they'd heard me anyway. My father's ruined leg was stretched out before him, as close to the fire's heat as it could get. The cold or the rain or any change in temperature always aggravated the vicious, twisted wounds around his knee. His simply carved cane was propped up against his chair, a cane he'd made for himself, and that Nesta was sometimes prone to leaving far out of his reach. Oh yeah, if she's gonna pick on her crippled father, she needs to die. Mostly because, as somebody who has a bad knee from when I was in high school, I fell wrong in a goalie outfit, and I really messed up my knee, and I've been limping kind of ever since then. It's worse on bad weather days. He could find work if he wasn't too ashamed, Nesta always said when I hissed about it. She hated him for the injury, too, for not fighting back when the creditor and his thugs burst into the cottage and smashed his knee again and again. Nesta and Elaine had fled into the bedroom, barricading the door. I had stayed, begging and weeping through every scream of my father, every crush of bone. I'd soiled myself, then vomited right on the stones before the hearth. Only then did the men leave. We never saw them again. We used a massive chunk of our remaining money to pay for the healer. It had taken my father 6 months to even walk, a year before he could go a mile. The coppers he'd brought in, when someone pitied him enough to buy his wood carvings, wasn't enough to keep us fed. 5 years ago, when the money was well and truly gone, when my father wouldn't move much about, he hadn't argued when I announced that I was going hunting. He hadn't bothered to attempt to stand from his seat by the father, hadn't bothered to look up from his wood carving. He just let me walk into those deadly, eerie woods that even most seasoned hunters were wary of. He'd become a little more aware now, sometimes offered signs of gratitude, sometimes hobbled all the way into town to sell his carvings, but not much. I'd love a new cloak, Elaine said at last with a sigh. At the same moment, Nesta rose and declared, I need a new pair of boots. I kept quiet, knowing better than to get in the middle of one of their arguments. I glanced at Nesta's still shiny pair by the door. Beside hers, my two small boots were falling apart at the seams, held together only by fraying laces. But I'm freezing with my raggedy old cloak, Elaine pleaded. I'll shiver to death. She fixed her eyes on me and said, Please, Feyre. She drew out the last two syllables of my name. Feyre, into the most hideous whine I'd ever endured. Nesta loudly clicked her tongue before ordering her to shut up. I drowned the two of them out as they began quarreling over who would get the money the hides would fetch tomorrow, and found my father now standing at the table, one hand braced against it to support his weight as he inspected the deer. His attention slid to the giant wolf pelt, his fingers still smooth and gentlemanly turned over the pelt and traced over the bloody underside. I tensed. His dark eyes flicked to mine. Feyre, he muttered. His mouth became a tight line. Where did you get this? The same place I got the deer, I replied with an equal quiet, my words cool and sharp. His gaze turned over the bow and quiver strapped to my back, the wooden hilted hunting knife at my side. His eyes turned damp. Feyre, the risk. Oh, now he cares about the risk. Oh, okay. Based on the fact that he hasn't before now? Feyre, I jerked my chin to the pelt, unable to keep the snap from my voice. I had no other choice. What I really wanted to say was, you don't even bother to attempt to leave the house most days. Were it not for me, we would starve. Were it not for me, we'd be dead. Feyre, he repeated, closing his eyes. My sisters had gone quiet, and I looked up in time to see Nesta crinkle her nose with a sniff. She picked at my cloak. You stink like a pig covered in its own filth. Can you at least try to pretend you're not an ignorant peasant? I didn't let the sting and ache show. I'd been too young to learn more than basic manners and reading and writing when our family had fallen into misfortune, and she never let me forget it. She stepped back and ran a finger over the braided coils of her gold-brown hair. Take the disgusting clothes off. I took my time, swallowing the words I wanted to bark back at her. Older than me by 3 years, she somehow looked younger than I did. Her golden cheeks always flushed with a delicate and vibrant pink. Can you make a pot of hot water and add wood to the fire? But even when I asked, I noticed the wood pile. There were only 5 logs left. I thought you were going to chop wood today. Nesta picked at her long, neat nails. I'd hate chopping wood. I always get splinters. She glanced up from behind her dark lashes. Of all of us, Nesta looked the most like our mother, especially when she wanted something. Besides, Feyre, you're so much better at it. It takes you half the time it takes me. Your hands are suited for it. They're already so rough. My jaw clenched. Pleased? I asked, calming my breathing, knowing an argument would be the last thing I needed or wanted. Please get up at dawn and chop that wood. I unbuttoned the top of my tunic, or we'll be eating a cold breakfast. Her brows narrowed. I will do no such thing. But I was already walking towards the small second room where my sisters and I slept. Elaine muttered a soft plea to Nesta, which earned her a hiss in response. I glanced over my shoulder at my father and pointed to the deer. Get the knives ready, I said, not bothering to sound unpleasant. I'll be out soon. Without waiting for an answer, I shut the door behind me. The room was large enough for a rickety dresser and the enormous ironwood bed we slept in. The sole remnant of our former wealth. It had been ordered as a wedding gift from my father to my mother. It was the bed in which we'd been born, and the bed in which my mother had died. In the painting I'd done up to our house these past few years, in all the painting I had done to our house this past few years, I had never touched it. I slung off my elder clothes, sagging to the sagging onto the sagging dresser, and frowned at the violets and roses I'd painted around the knobs of Elaine's drawer, the crackling flames I'd painted around Nesta's, and the night sky, the whirls of yellow stars standing in for white around mine. I'd done it to brighten the otherwise dark room. They'd never commented on it. I don't know why I ever expected them to. Groaning was all I can do to keep from collapsing onto the bed. We dined on roasted venison that night. Though I knew it was foolish, I didn't object when each of us had a small second helping until I'd declared the meat off limits. I'd spend tomorrow preparing the deer's remaining parts for consumption, and then I'd allot a few hours to currying up both hides before taking them to the market. I knew of a few vendors who might be interested in such a purchase, though neither was likely to give me the fee I deserved. But money was money, and I didn't have time or the funds to travel to the nearest large town to find a better offer. I sucked on the tines of my fork, savoring the remains of the fat coating the metal. My tongue slipped over the crooked prongs. The fork was part of a shabby set my father had scavenged from the servants' quarters while the creditors ransacked our manor home. None of our utensils matched, but it was better than using our fingers. My mother's dowry flatware had long since been sold. My mother, imperious and cold with her children, joyous and dazzling among the peerage who frequented our former estate, doting on my father, the one person whom she truly loved and respected. But she also had truly loved those parties, so much that she didn't have the time to do anything with me at all, save contemplate how my budding abilities to sketch and paint might secure me a future husband. Had she lived long enough to see our wealth crumble, she would have been shattered by it, more so than my father. Perhaps it was a merciful thing that she had died. If anything, it left more food for us. There was nothing left of her in the cottage beyond, and I'm going to give me a second. Yeah, I'll edit out. I believe I was at You know what? I'll just start from the top. If anything, it left more food for us, and there was nothing left of her in the cottage beyond the ironwood bed and the vow I'd made. Every time I looked towards the horizon or wondered if I should just walk and walk and walk and never look back, I'd hear that promise I'd made 11 years ago when she wasted away on her deathbed. Stay together and look after them. I'd agreed, too young to ask why she hadn't begged my elder sisters or my father. But I'd sworn it to her, and then she died, and in our miserable human world, shielded away only by the promise made by the high fae 5 centuries ago, in our world, where we'd forgotten the names of our gods, a promise was law, a promise was a currency, a promise was your bond. Though there were times when I hated her for asking that vow of me. Perhaps delirious with fever, she hadn't even known what she was demanding, or maybe or maybe her impending death had given her some clarity about the true nature of her children. her husband. I asked I sat down the fork and watched the flames of our meager fire dance along the remaining logs. Stretched out my aching legs beneath the table, I turned to my sisters. As you as usual, Nesta was complaining about the villagers. They had no manners, they had no social graces, they had no idea just how shoddy the fabric of their clothes were, even though they pretended it was just as fine as silk and chiffon. Since we'd lost our fortune, our former friends dutifully ignored them. Their former friends dutifully ignored them, so my sisters paraded about as though the young peasants of the town made up a second-rate social circle. So, in other words, instead of trying to fit in with and make new friends, they still saw themselves as better. Okay. I took a sip from my cup of hot water. We couldn't even afford tea these days, Nesta continued her story to Elaine. Well, I said to him, if you think you could just ask me so nonchalantly, sir, I'm going to decline. And you know what Thomas said? Arms braced on the table and eyes wide, Elaine shook her head. Thomas Mandry? I interrupted. The woodcutter's second son? Nesta's gray eyes narrowed. Yes. She sifted to address Elaine again. What does he want? I glanced at my father. No reaction, no hint of alarm or sign he was even listening. Lost to whatever fog of memory had crept over him, he was smiling mildly at his beloved Elaine, the only one of us who bothered to really speak to him at all. He wants to marry her, Elaine said dreamily. I blinked. Nesta cocked her head. I'd seen predators use that movement before. I sometimes wondered if her unrelenting steel would have helped us better thrive even, if she hadn't been so preoccupied with our loss in status. Is there a problem, Feyre? She flung my name like an insult, and my jaw ached from clenching it so hard. My father shifted in his seat, blinking. Though I know it was foolish to react to her taunts, I said, you can't chop wood for us, but you want to marry a woodcutter's son? Nesta squared her shoulders. I thought all you wanted was for us to get out of the house, to marry off me and Elaine, so you could have enough time to paint your glorious masterpieces, she sneered, as at the pillar of foxglove I'd painted along the edge of the table. The colors too dark and too blue, with none of the white freckling across the trumpets, freckling inside of the trumpets. But I'd made do, making sure even if it killed me, not to have white paint, to make something so flawed and lasting. I drowned the urge to cover up the painting with my hand. Maybe tomorrow I'd just scrape it off the table altogether. Believe me, I said to her, the day you want to marry someone worthy, I'll march up to his house and hand you over, but you're not going to marry Thomas. Nesta's nostril delicately flared. There's nothing you can do. Claire Better told me this afternoon that Thomas is going to propose to me any day now. And then I'll never have to eat these scraps again, she added with a small smile. At least I don't have to resort to rutting in the hay with Isaac Hale like an animal. My father let out an embarrassed cough, looking to his cot by the fire. He'd never said a word against Nesta, either from fear or guilt, and apparently he wasn't going to start now, even if this was the first he was hearing of Isaac. I laid my palms flat on the table and I stared her down. Elaine removed her hand from where it lay nearby, as if the dirt and blood beneath my fingernails, not tips, my bad, would somehow jump to her porcelain skin. Thomas's family is barely better off than ours, I said, trying to keep from growling. You'd just be another mouth to feed. If he doesn't know this, then his parents must. But Thomas knew. We'd run into each other in the forest before. I'd seen a gleam of desperate hunger in his eyes when he spotted me sporting a brace of rabbits. I'd never killed another human, but that day my hunting knife still felt like a weight at my side. My hunting knife had felt like a weight at my side. I kept out of his way ever since. We can't afford a dowry, I continued, and though my tone was firm, my voice quieted, for either of you. If Nesta wanted to leave, then fine, good. I'd be one step closer to attaining the glorious, peaceful future of attaining a quiet house and enough food and time to paint. But we had nothing, absolutely nothing, to entice any suitor to take my sisters off my hands. We're in love, Nesta declared, and Elaine nodded her agreement. I almost laughed. Had they gone from mooning over aristocrats to making doe eyes at peasants? Love won't feed a hungry belly, I countered, keeping my eyes sturdy as possible. As if I struck her, Nesta leapt from her seat on the bench. You're just jealous. I heard them saying how Isaac is going to marry some Greenfield village girl for a handsome dowry. So had I. Isaac had ranted about it the last time we met. Jealous? I asked slowly, digging down deep to bury my fury. We have nothing to offer them. No dowry, no livestock even. Well, Tomas didn't want to marry you. Might want to marry you. You're a burden. What do you know? Nesta breathed. You're just a half-wild beast with the nerve to bark orders at all hours of the day and night. Keep it up and someday, Feyre, you'll have no one left to remember you, or to care that you ever existed. She stormed off, Elaine darting after her, cooing her sympathy. They slammed the door to the bedroom hard enough to rattle the dishes. I'd heard the words before, knew she only repeated them because I flinched the first time she spat them. They still burned anyway. I took a long sip from the chip mug. A wooden bench beneath my father groaned as he shifted. I took another swallow and said, You should talk some sense into her. He examined a burn mark on the table. What can I say if it's love? It can't be love. Not on his part. Not with his wretched family. I'd seen the way he acts around the village. There's one thing he wants from her, and it's not her hand in. We need hope as much as we need bread and meat, he interrupted, his eyes clear for a rare moment. We need hope, or else we cannot endure. Let her keep this hope, Feyre. Let her imagine a better life, a better world. I stood from the table, fingers curling into fists, but there was nowhere to run in our two-room cottage. I looked at the discolored foxglove painting the edge of the table. The outer trumpets were already chipped and faded, the lower bit of the stem rubbed off entirely. Within a few years it'd be gone, leaving no mark that had ever been there, that I had ever been there. When I looked at my father, my gaze was hard. There is no such thing. So that was chapter 2. Okay. Moving into 3. The trampled snow coating the road to our village was speckled with brown and black from passing carts and horses. Elaine and Nesta clicked their tongues and grimaced as we made our way along it, dodging the particularly disgusting parts. And I knew why they'd come. They had taken one look at the hides I'd folded into my satchels and grabbed their cloaks. I didn't bother talking to them as they hadn't decided to speak to me after last night. Though Nesta had awoken at dawn to chop wood. Probably because she knew I'd be selling the hides at the market today and would go home with the money in my pocket. They trailed down the lane road, winding through the snow-covered fields all the way to our ramshackle village. The stone houses of the village were ordinary and dull, made grimmer by the bleakness of winter. But it was market day, which meant that the tiny square in the center of the village would be full of whatever vendors had braved the brisk morning. From a block away, the scent of hot food wafted by, spices tugged on the edge of my memory, beckoning. Elaine let out a low moan behind me. Spices, salt, sugar, rare commodities for most of our village. Impossible for us to afford. If I did well at the market, perhaps I'd have enough to buy us something delicious. I opened my mouth to suggest it, but we turned the corner and nearly stumbled into one another as we halted. May the immortal light shine upon thee, sisters, said the pale robed young woman directly in our path. Elaine and Nesta clicked their tongues. I stifled a groan. Perfect. Exactly what we needed. To have children of blessed in town on market day, distracting and riling everyone. The village elders usually allowed them to stay for only a few hours, but the sheer presence of the fanatic fools who still worshipped the high fae made people edgy. Made me edgy. Long ago, the high fae had been our overlords, not gods, and they certainly hadn't been kind. The young woman extended her moon-white hands in a gesture of greeting, a bracelet of silver bells, real silver, tinkling at her wrist. Have you a moment to spare so that you might hear the word of the blessed? No, Nesta sneered, ignoring the girl's hands and nudging Elaine into a walk. We don't. The woman's unbound dark hair gleaming in morning light, and her clean, fresh face glowed as she smiled prettily. There were 5 other acolytes behind her, young men and women both, their hair long and uncut, scanning the market, looking for young folk to pester. It would take but a minute, the woman said, stepping into Nesta's path. It was impressive, truly impressive, to see Nesta go ramrod straight and square her shoulders and look down her nose at the young acolytes. A queen without a throne. Go spew your fanatic nonsense to some ninny. You find no converts here. And I'll be right back. The girl shrank back, a shadow flickering in her brown eyes. I reined in my wince. Perhaps not the best way to deal with them, since they became a true nuisance of agitated. Nesta lifted her hand, pushing down the sleeve of her coat to show the iron bracelet there. The same one Elaine wore. They bought matching adornments years ago. The acolyte gasped, eyes wide. You see this? Nesta hissed, taking a step forward. The acolyte retreated a step. This is what you should be wearing. Not some silver bells to attract those fairy monsters. How dare you wear that vile affront to our immortal friends? Go preach in another town, Nesta spat. Okay, so we are a little mean to the fae. I don't know if I like that, but okay. Different fae, not real fae. Cool. It's a make-believe story. Okay. 2 plump and pretty farmers' wives strolled past on their way to the market, arm in arm. As they neared the acolytes, their face twisted in an identical expression of disgust. Fairy-loving whore, one of them hurled at the young woman. I couldn't disagree. The acolytes kept silent. The other villager, wealthy enough to have a full necklace of braided iron around her throat, narrowed her eyes, her upper lip curling back from her teeth. Don't you idiots understand that what those monsters did to us for all those centuries? what they could still do for sport when they can get away with it. You deserve the end you will meet at fairy hands. Fools and whores, all of you. Nesta nodded her agreement to the woman as they continued on their way. They turned back to the young We turned back to the young woman still lingering before us, and even Elaine frowned in distaste. But the young woman took a breath, her face becoming serene, and said, I lived in such ignorance too, until I heard the word of the blessed. I grew up in a village similar to this, so bleak and grim. But not 1 month ago, a friend of my cousin went to the border to as our offering to Prythian, and she has not been sent back. Now she dwells in riches and comfort as a high fae bride. So might you, if you were to take a moment to... She was likely eaten, said Nesta. That's why she hasn't returned. Or worse, I thought, if a high fae truly was involved in spiriting a human into Prythian. I'd never encountered the cruel, human-looking high fae who ruled Prythian itself, or the fairies who occupied their lands. But with their scales and wings and long, spindly arms that could drag you deep, deep beneath the surface of a forgotten pond, I didn't know which would be worse to face. The acolyte's face tightened. Our benevolent masters would never harm us. Prythian is a land of peace and plenty. Should they bless you with their attention, you would be glad to live among them. Nesta rolled her eyes. Elaine was shooting glances between us and the market ahead, as to the villagers now watching too. Time to go. Nesta opened her mouth again, but I stepped between them and ran an eye along the girl's pale blue robes, the silver jewelry on her, and the utter cleanliness of her skin. Not a mark or smudge to be found. You're fighting an uphill battle, I said to her. A worthy cause, the girl beamed. Beautiful. I think it's supposed to be beautifully. Because I've never seen that word. Nesta gave her a gentle push to get her walking and said to the acolyte, No, it's not. I gave Nesta a gentle push to get her walking and said to the acolyte, No, it's not. I could hear the acolyte's attention now fixed on us as we strode into the busy market square. But I didn't look back. They'd be gone soon enough, off to preach in another town. And we'd take the long way out of the village to avoid them when we were far enough away. Wait. We'd have to take... Okay, I'm assuming they mean on the way back. When we were far enough away, I glanced over my shoulder at my sisters. Elaine's face remained set to a wince, but Nesta's eyes were stormy, her lips thin. I wondered if she'd stomp back to the girl and pick a fight. Not my problem, not right now. I'll meet you here in an hour, I said. And didn't give them time to cling to me before stepping into the crowded square. It took me 10 minutes to contemplate my 3 options. There were my usual buyers, the weathered cobbler, the sharp-eyed clothier who came to our market from a near town, and the sharp-eyed clothier who came to our market from a nearby town, and then the unknown, a mountain of a woman sitting on the lip of our broken square fountain without a cart or stall, but looking like she was holding court nonetheless. The scars and weapons on her marked her easily enough. A mercenary. I could feel the eyes of the cobbler and clothier on me, and sensed their feigned disinterest as they took in the satchel I bore. Fine, it would be that sort of day then. I approached the mercenary, whose thick, dark hair was shorn to her chin. Her tan face seemed hewn of granite, and her black eyes narrow slightly at the sight of me. Such interesting eyes, not just the shade of black, but many, with hints of brown that gleamed amongst the shadows. I pushed back that useless part of my mind. The instincts had me thinking about color and light and shape, and kept my shoulders back as she assessed me as a potential threat or employer. The weapons on her, gleaming and wicked, were enough to make me swallow and stop a good 2 feet away. I don't barter goods for my services, she said, her voice chipped with an accent I'd never heard before. I only accept coin. A few passing villagers tried their best not to look too interested in our conversation, especially as I said, "Then you're out of luck in this sort of place." She was massive, even sitting down. "What is your business with me, girl?" She could have been aged anywhere from 25 to 30. I supposed I looked like a girl to her in my layers, gangly from hunger. "I have a wolf pelt and a doe hide for sale. I thought you might be interested in purchase them." "You steal them?" "No," I held her stare. "I hunted them." I just realized I left the camera down. Well, okay then. The camera fell down. I just realized. Oh, man. It's fine. She ran those dark eyes down me again. How? Not a question, a command. Perhaps someone who had encountered others who did not see as vows were sacred, words as bonds, and had punished them accordingly. So I told her how. I brought them down, and when I finished, she flicked a hand over toward my satchel. "Let me see." I pulled both carefully folded hides. "You weren't lying about the wolf size," she muttered. "Doesn't seem like a fairy, though." She examined them with an expert eye, running her hands over and under. She named her price. I blinked, then stifled the urge to blink a second time. She was overplaying by a lot. She stared beyond me, past me. "I'm assuming those 2 girls watching from across the square are your sisters. You all have that brassy hair and that hungry look about you." Indeed. They were trying their best to eavesdrop without being spotted. "I don't need your pity." "No, but you need my money. And the other traders have been cheap all morning. Everyone's too distracted by those calf-eyed zealots bleeding across the square." She jerked her chin towards the children of the blessed, still ringing their silver bells and jumping into the path of everyone who tried to walk away. The mercenary was smiling faintly when I turned back to her. "Up to you, girl." "Why?" "Because someone once did the same for me and mine at a time when we needed it most. Figured it's time to repay what's due." I watched her again, weighing. "My father has some word carvings that I could give you to make it more fair. I travel light and have no need for them. These, however," she patted the pelts, "save me the trouble of killing them myself." I nodded, my cheeks heating as she reached for the coin purse inside her heavy coat. It was full, weighed down with at least silver, possibly gold, if the clinking was any distinction. Mercenaries tend to be well paid in our territory. Our territory was too small and too poor to maintain a standing army to monitor the wall with Prythian. We villagers could rely on the strength of the treaty forged. Could rely only on the strength of the treaty forged 500 years ago. But the upper class could afford hired swords, like this woman, to guard their lands, bordering the immortal realm. It was an illusion of comfort, just as the markings on our threshold were. We all knew, deep down, that there was nothing to be done against the fairies. We'd all been told it, regardless of our class or rank, from the moment we were born. Warnings sung to us as we rocked in our cradles, and rhymes chanted in the schoolyards. One of the high fae could turn your bones to dust from 100 yards away. Not that my sisters or I had ever seen it. But we still tried to believe something, anything, might work against them, if we were to ever encounter them. There were 2 stalls in the market catering to those fears, offering charms and baubles and incantations and bits of iron. I couldn't afford them. And if they indeed did work, they would buy us only a few minutes to prepare ourselves. Running was futile, so was fighting. But Nesta and Elaine still wore their iron bracelets whenever they left the cottage. Even Isaac had an iron cuff around one wrist, always tucked under his sleeve. He once offered to buy me one, but I refused. It felt too personal. Too much like payment to permanent, a reminder of whatever we were and weren't to each other. The mercenary transferred the coins into my waiting palm, and I tucked them into my pocket, their weight as heavy as a millstone. There was no possible chance that my sisters hadn't spotted the money, no chance that they weren't already wondering how they might persuade me to give them some. "Thank you," I said to the mercenary, trying and failing to keep the bite from my voice as I felt my sisters sweep closer, like vultures circling a carcass. The mercenary stroked the wolf pet. A world of advice from one hunter to another. I lifted my brows. "Don't go far into the woods. I wouldn't even get close to where you were yesterday. A wolf this size would be the least of your problems. More and more I've been hearing stories about those things slipping in through the wall." A chill spider walked down my spider walked. Okay. I was like, there's a spider? I missed the dash. Are they going to attack? If it were true, I'd have to find a way to get my family off our miserable, damp territory and head south. Head far from the invisible wall that bisected our world before they could ever cross it. Once, long ago, and for millennia before that, we'd been slaves to the High Fae overlords. Once we'd built them glorious and sprawling civilizations from our blood and sweat. Built them temples to their feral gods. Once we had rebelled across every land and territory. The war had been so bloody, so destructive, that it took 6 mortal queens crafting the treaty for the slaughter to cease on both sides, and for the wall to be constructed. The north of our world conceded to the High Fae and fairies who took their magic with them. The south to we cowering mortals, forever forced to scratch out a living from the earth. "No one knows what the Fae are planning," the mercenary said, her face like stone. "We don't know if the High Lord's leash on their beasts is slipping or if these are targeted attacks. I guarded for an old nobleman who claimed it had been getting worse these past 50 years. He got on a boat south 2 weeks ago and told me I should leave if I was smart. Before he sailed off, he admitted that he'd had word from one of his friends that in the dead of night a pack of Martax crossed the wall and tore half his village apart." Martax, I breathed. I knew these were different types of fairies, and that they'd varied as much as any other species of animal, but I knew only a few by name. The mercenary's dark eyes flickered. Body as big as a bear's, head is something like a lion's, and 3 rows of teeth sharper than a shark's. And meaner than all 3 of them put together. They left the village in literal ribbons, the nobleman said. My stomach turned. Behind us, my sisters seemed so fragile. Their pale skin and so infinitely delicate and shreddable. Against something like the Martax, we'd never stand a chance. Those children of the blessed were fools, fanatic fools. So we don't know what all these attacks mean, the mercenary went on, other than more hires for me and you keeping well away from the wall. Especially if the High Fae are turning up, or worse, one of the High Lords. They would make the Matrix seem like dogs. I studied her scarred hands, chipped from the cold. Have you ever faced another type of fairy? Her eyes shuddered. You don't want to know, girl. Not unless you want to be, hurling up your breakfast. I was indeed feeling ill and jumpy. Was it deadlier than the Matrix? I dared ask. The woman pulled back her sleeve of her heavy jacket, revealing a tanned, muscled forearm flecked with gruesome, twisted scars. The arc of them so similar to... didn't have the brute force or size of a Matrix, she said, but its bite was full of poison. 2 months, that's how long I was down. 4 months until I had the strength to walk again. She pulled up the leg of her trousers. Beautiful, I thought, even as the horror of it wreathed in my gut. Against her tan skin, the veins were black, solid black, spiderwebbed, creeping up like frost. Hey, that's me. The healer said there was nothing to be done for it, and that I'm lucky to be walking with the poison still in my legs. Maybe it'll kill me one day. Maybe it'll cripple me. But at least I'll go knowing I killed it first. The blood in my own veins seemed to chill as she lowered the cuff of her pants. If anyone in the square had seen, no one had dared to speak about it. Or come closer. And I'd had enough for one day, so I took a step back, steadying myself against what she told me and showed me. Thanks for the warnings, I said. Her attention flickered behind me. She gave a faintly amused smile. Good luck. A slender hand clamped onto my forearm, dragging me away. I knew it was Nesta before I even looked at her. They're dangerous, Nesta hissed, her fingers digging against my arm as she continued to pull me from the mercenary. Don't go near them again. I stared at her a moment, then at Elaine, whose face had gone pale and tight. Is there something I need to know? I asked quietly. I couldn't remember the last time Nesta tried to warn me about anything. Elaine was the only one who bothered to really look... Elaine was the only one she really bothered to look after. They're brutes, and will take any copper they can get, even if it's by force. I glanced at the mercenary, who was examining her new pelts. She robbed you? Not her. Some other one who passed through. We'd only had a few coins, and he got mad, but... Why didn't you report him, or tell me? What could you have done, Nesta sneered. Challenged him to a fight with your bow and arrows? And who in this Sioux town would even care if we report everything? What about your Thomas Mandray? I said coolly. Nesta's eyes flashed, but movement behind me caught her eye, and she gave me what I supposed was her attempt at a sweet smile, probably because she remembered the money I now carried. Your friend is waiting for you. I turned, indeed. Isaac was watching from across the square, arms crossed as he leaned against a building. Though the eldest son of the only well-off farmer in our village, he was still lean from the winter. His brown hair turned shaggy. Relatively handsome, soft-spoken, and reserved, but with a soft darkness running beneath it all that had drawn us together, that shared understanding of how wretched our lives were and would always be. We vaguely known each other for years, since my family had moved to the village, but I'd never thought much about him until we wound up walking down the main road together one afternoon. We'd only talked about the eggs he was bringing to market, and I admired the variation in colors within the basket he bore. Browns and tans and the lightest of blues and greens. Simple, easy perhaps, a bit awkward. But he'd left me at my cottage feeling not quite so alone. A week later, I pulled him into that decrepit barn. He had been my first and only lover in the 2 years since. Sometimes we met every night for a week. Other times we'd go a month without setting eyes on each other. But every time was the same. The rush of shedding clothes, the shared breaths of tongues and teeth. Occasionally we'd talk, or rather, he'd talk about the pressures, burdens of his father placed upon him. Often, we wouldn't say a word the entire time. I couldn't say our lovemaking was particularly skilled, but it was still a release, a reprieve, a bit of selfishness. There was no love between us, and there never had been, at least what I assumed people meant when they talked about love. Do we have an ace main character? Probably not. That would be cool, though. Yet part of me had sunk when he said that he would soon be married. Yet I wasn't desperate enough to ask him to see me after he was wed. Isaac inclined his head in a familiar gesture and then ambled off down the street, out of town, and to the ancient barn, where he would be waiting. We were never inconspicuous about our dealings with each other, but we did take measures to keep it from being too obvious. Nesta clicked her tongue, crossing her arms. I do hope you are taking precautions. Bit late to pretend to care, I said. But we were careful. And since I couldn't afford it, Isaac himself took the contraceptive brew. He knew I wouldn't have touched him otherwise. He reached into my pocket. I reached into my pocket, drawing out a 20-mark copper. Elaine sucked a breath, and I didn't bother to look at either of my sisters as I pushed it into her palm and said, I'll see you at home. Later, after the dinner of venison, when we were all gathered around the table for fire for quiet hour before my bed, I watched my sisters whispering and laughing together. They'd spent every copper I'd given them. Wait. 20-mark copper. You gave them copper, but was it worth 20? Was it one coin worth 20 copper? And is this copper like D&D copper, though? I need to know. I don't know, but I need to know. They'd spent every copper I'd given them on what I didn't know, though Elaine had brought back a new chisel for our father's wood carving. The cloak and boots they'd whined about the night before had been too expensive, but I hadn't scolded them for it, not when Nesta went out a second time to chop more wood without my asking. Mercifully, they avoided another confrontation with the children of the blessed. My father was dozing in his chair, his cane laid across his gnarled knee. As good a time as any to breach the subject of Tomas Manderley with Nesta. I turned to her, opened my mouth. But there was a roar that deafened me. My sisters screamed as snow burst into the room and an enormous growling shape appeared in the doorway. Oh, I can't leave it there. Instead of 2 and 3, I guess we're doing 4 too. But I will stop after 4. I didn't know how much the wooden hilt of my hunting knife had gotten into my hand. The first few moments were a blur of snarling giant beasts with golden fur, shrieking at my sisters, the blistering cold cascading into the room, and my father's terror-stricken face. Not a Martax, I realized. But the relief was short-lived. The beast had been as large as a horse, and while his body was somewhat feline, his head was distinctly wolfish. I didn't know what to make of the curled elk-like horns that protruded from his head. Not lion or hound or elk, but there was no doubting the damage on his back. Dagger-like claws and yellow fangs that his black dagger-like claws and yellow fangs could inflict. Had I been alone in the woods, I would have let myself be swallowed by fear. Might have fallen to my knees and wept for a clean, quick death. But I didn't have the room for terror. It wouldn't give an inch of space, despite my heart's pounding in my ears. Somehow, I wound up in front of my sisters, even if, as the creature reared onto its hind legs and bellowed through a maw full of fangs. Murderers! Okay, so even though the mercenary told her that the wolf wasn't a fairy, I'm assuming he was. Though it was another world that echoed through me. Fairy. Those those wards on our threshold were as good as cobwebs against him. I should have asked the mercenary how she killed that fairy. But the beast's thick neck looked like a good home for my knife. I dared glance over my shoulder. My sister screamed, kneeling against the edge of the hearth. My father crouched in front of them, another body for me to defend. Stupidly, I took another step towards the fairy, keeping the table between us. My bow and quiver were across the room, past the beast. I'd have to get around him to reach the ash arrow. I thought you used it. And buy enough time to fire it. Murderers! The beast roared again, hackles raised. Please, my father babbled from behind me, failing to find it in himself to come to my side. Whatever we've done, we did so unwillingly, unknowingly, and we didn't kill anyone, Nesta said, choking on a shab's arm lifted over her head, as if the tiny iron bracelet would do anything against the creature. I snatched another dinner knife off the table, the best I could do unless I found a way to get to the quiver. Get out, I snapped at the creature, brandishing the knives before me. No iron in sight that I could use as a weapon, unless I chucked my sister's bracelets at him. Get out and be gone. With my trembling hands, I could barely keep the grip on the hilts. A nail. I'd take a damned iron nail if it were available. He bellowed at me in response, and the entire cottage shook, the plates and cups rattling against one another. But it left his massive neck exposed. I hurled my hunting knife. Fast, so fast I could barely see it. He slashed out with a paw, sending it scattering away as he snapped from my face with his teeth. I leaped back, almost stumbling over my cowering father. The fairy seemed to have could have killed me. Could have. Yet the lunge had been a warning. Nesta and Elaine, weeping, prayed to whatever forgotten gods might still be skulking about. Who killed him? The creature stalked towards us. He set a paw on the table. It groaned beneath him. His claws thudded as they embedded in the wood, one by one. I dared step forward as the beast stretched, his snout over the table to sniff at us. His eyes were green and flecked with amber. Not animal eyes. Not with their shape and coloring. My voice was surprisingly even as I challenged. Killed who? He growled, low and vicious. The wolf, he said. And my heart stumbled a beat. The roar was gone, but the wrath lingered, perhaps even traced with sorrow. Elaine's wail reached a high-pitched shriek, and I kept my chin up. A wolf, a large wolf with a gray coat. He snarled in response. Would he know if I lied? Fairies couldn't lie. All mortals knew that, but could they smell lies on human tongues? We had no chance of escaping this through fighting, but there might be other ways. If it was mistakenly killed, I said to the beast, calmly before I could. What payment could we offer in exchange? This was all a nightmare, and I'd Awaken in and I'd awaken in a moment beside the fire, exhausted from my day at the market and my afternoon with Isaac. The beast let out a bark that could have been a bitter laugh. He pushed off the table uh, to pace in a small circle before the shattered door. The cold was so intense that I shivered. The payment you must offer is the one demanded by the treaty between our realms. For a wolf, I retorted. My father's murmured my name in warning, but I had vague memories of being read the treaty during my childhood lessons. But could recall nothing about wolves. Who curled the beast whirled on me? Who killed the wolf? I stared into those jade eyes. I did. He blinked and glanced at my sisters, then back at me in at my thinness, no doubt seeing only frailness instead. Surely you lied to save them. We didn't kill anything, Elaine wept. Please, please spare us. Nesta hushed her sharply through her own sobbing, but pushed Elaine further behind her. My chest caved at the sight of it. My father climbed to his feet, grunting at the pain in his leg as he hobbled. But before he could limp towards me, I repeated, I killed it. The beast, who had been sniffing at my sisters, studied me, and I squared my I squared my shoulders. I sold its hide at the market today. If I had known it was a fairy, I wouldn't have touched it. Liar, he snarled. You knew. You would have been more tempted to slaughter it, had you known it was one of my kind. True, true, true. Can you blame me? Did it attack you? Were you provoked? I opened my mouth to say yes, but no, I said, letting out a snarl of my own. But considering all that your kind has done to us, considering that your kind still likes what your kind still likes to do to us, even if I had known beyond a doubt it was deserved. Better to die with my chin held high than groveling like a cowering worm, even if his answering growl was a definition of wrath and rage. The firelight shone upon his exposed fangs, and I wondered how they'd feel on my throat, how loudly my sisters would scream before they too died. But I knew, with a sudden coiling clarity, that Nesta would buy Elaine some time to run. Not my father, whom she resented with her steely heart. Not me, because Nesta had always known and hated that she and I were two sides of the same coin, and that I could fight my own battles. But Elaine, the flower grower, the gentle heart, Nesta would go down swinging for her. It was a flash of understanding that had me angling my remaining knife at the beast. What is the payment the treaty requires? His eyes didn't leave my face, and he said, a life for a life. Any unprovoked attacks on fairy kind by humans are to be paid only by a human life in exchange. My sisters quieted their weeping. The mercenary in town had killed a fairy, but it had attacked her first. I didn't know, I said. Didn't know about that part of the treaty. Fairies couldn't lie, and he'd spoken plainly enough. No word twisting. Most of you mortals have chosen to forget about that part of the treaty, he said, which makes punishing you for it all the more enjoyable. My knees quaked. I couldn't escape this, couldn't outrun this. Couldn't even try to run, since he blocked the way to the door. Do it outside, I whispered, my voice trembling. Not here. Not where my family would have to wash away my blood and gore, if he even let me live. The fairy huffed a vicious laugh. Willing to accept your fate so easily? When I just stared at him, he said, for having the nerve to request where I slaughter you. Where I slaughter you, I'll let you on a secret, human. Prythian must claim your life in some way, for the life you took from it. So, as a representative of the immortal realm, I can either gut you like a swine, or you can cross the wall and live out your remainder of your days in Prythian. I blinked. What? He said slowly, as if I were indeed a swine. You can either die tonight or offer your life to Prythian by living in it forever, forsaking the mortal realm. Do it, Feyre, my father whispered behind me. Go. I didn't look to him. As I said, live where? Every inch of Prythian is lethal to us. I'd be better off dying tonight than living in pure terror across the wall until I meet my end on in doubtlessly an even more awful way. I have lands, the fairy said quietly, almost reluctantly. I will grant you permission to live there. Why bother? Perhaps a fool's question, but you murdered my friend, the beast snarled. Murdered him, skinned his corpse, sold it at the market, and then said he deserved it. And yet you have the nerve to question my generosity? How typical of a human, he seemed to silently add. You didn't even mention the loophole. I stepped close to the Fae's breath. Heated my face. Faes couldn't lie, but they could emit information. The beast snarled again. Foolish of me to forget humans have such low opinions of us. Do you humans no longer understand mercy? He said, his fangs inches from my throat. Let me be clear for you, girl. You can either come live at my home in Prythian, offer your life for the wolves in that way, or you can walk outside right now and be shredded to ribbons. Your choice. My father's hobbling steps sounded before he gripped my shoulders. Please, good sir, Feyre is my youngest. I beseech you to spare her. She is all, but whatever he meant to say died in his throat as the beast roared again. But hearing those few words, he managed to get out the effort he'd made. It was like a blade in my belly. My father cringed as he said, please. Silence, the creature snapped. Rage boiled up in me, so blistering it was an effort to keep from lunging to stab my dagger in his eye. But by the time I'd so much as raised my arm, I knew he would have his maw around my neck. I can get gold, my father said. My rage guttered. The only way he would get money is by begging. Even then he'd be lucky to get a few coppers. I'd seen how pitiless the well-off were in our village. Pitiless the well-off were in our village. The monsters in our mortar realm were just as bad as those across the wall. The beast sneered. How much is your daughter's life worth to you? Do you think it equates to a sum? Nesta still had Elaine behind her, Elaine's face so pale as it now matched the snow drifting in from the open door. But Nesta monitored every move the beast made, her brows lowered. She didn't bother to look at my father, as if she knew his answer already. My father didn't reply. I dared another step towards the beast, drawing his attention to me. I had to get him out, get him away from my family. From the way he brushed away my knife, any hope of escaping lay somehow in sneaking up on him. With his hearing, I doubted I'd get a chance any time soon, at least until he believed I was docile. If I had tried to attack him or fled before then, he would destroy my family for the sheer enjoyment of it, and then he would find me again. I had no choice but to go, and then later, I might find an opportunity to slit the beast's throat and disable him long enough to flee. As long as the fairies couldn't find me again, they couldn't hold me to the treaty, even if it made me a cursed oath-breaker. But in going with him, I would be breaking the most important promise I ever made. Surely it trumped an ancient treaty I hadn't even signed. I loosened my grip on the hilt of my remaining dagger and stared into those green eyes for a long, silent while before I said, When do we go? Those lupine features remained fierce, vicious. Any lingering hope I had of fighting died as he moved to the door. No, to the quiver I left behind it. He pulled out the ash arrow, sniffed it, and snarled at it. With 2 movements, he snapped it in half and chucked it into the fire behind my sisters before turning back to me. He could smell my doom on his breath. I could smell my doom on his breath, and as he said, "Now, now." Even Elaine lifted her head to gape at me in mute horror. I couldn't look at her. Couldn't look at Nesta, not when they were still crouched there, still silent. I turned to my father, his eyes glistened. So I glanced to the few cabinets we had. Faded yellow two yellow daffodils curving around over the handles. Now, the beast paced at the doorway. I didn't want to contemplate where I was going or what he would do to me. Running would be foolish until it was the right time. The venison should hold you for 2 weeks, I said to my father, as I gathered my clothes to bulk up against the cold. Start on the fresh meat and then work your way through to the jerky. You know how to make it. Feyre, my father breathed, but I continued as I fastened my cloak. I left the money from the pelts on the dresser. It will last you for a time if you're careful. I looked at my father again and allowed myself to memorize the lines of his face. My eyes stung, but I blinked the moisture away as I stuffed my hands into my worn gloves. When spring comes, the hunt in the grove just south of the big bend in Silver Spring Creek. The rabbits there make their warrens. Ask Isaac Hale to show you how to make snares. I taught him last year. My father nodded, covering his mouth with a hand. The beast growled his warning and prowled out into the night. I made to follow him, but paused to look at my sisters still crouched by the fire, as if they wouldn't dare move until I was gone. Elaine mouthed my name, but kept her head down. I turned to Nesta, whose face was so similar to my mother's, so cold and unrelenting. Whatever you do, I said quietly, don't marry Thomas Mandray. His father beats his wife, and none of his sons do anything to stop it. Nesta's eyes widened, but I added, bruises are harder to conceal than poverty. Nesta stiffened, but said nothing. Both of my sisters said absolutely nothing as I turned toward the open door, but a hand wrapped around my arm, tugging me to a stop. Turning me around to face him, my father opened and closed his mouth. Outside, the beast, sensing I'd been detained, sent a snarl rumbling into the cottage. Feyre, my father said, his fingers trembling as he grasped my gloved hands, but his eyes became clearer and bolder than I'd seen them in years. You were always too good for me. Good for here, Feyre. Too good for us. Too good for everyone. He squeezed my hands. If you ever escape, ever convince them that you've paid the debt, don't return. I hadn't expected a heart-wrenching goodbye, but I hadn't imagined this either. Don't ever come back, my father said, releasing his hands to shake me by the shoulders. Feyre, you go somewhere new, and you make a name for... He stumbled over my name. His throat bobbing. You go somewhere new, and you make a name for yourself. Beyond the beast was just a shadow. A life for a life. But what if the life offered as payment also meant losing 3 others? The thought alone was enough to steel me, to anchor me. I never told my father of the promise I made my mother, and there was no use explaining it now, so I shrugged off his grip and left. I let the sounds of the snow crunching underfoot drive out my father's words as I followed the beast into the night-shrouded woods. And with that, that is the end of reading those 3 chapters. Yeah, okay. With that, we're done. Thank you for joining me for this read along, and I hope you guys had a good go of it. Come again.